Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at Truman and post-war Reconstruction in the years 1945 to 1952. Now Truman ends his term in office as often portrayed as a complete failure, and that many of his policies had gone wrong and he had huge problems with Congress. And in this video we're going to be exploring some of these issues. We're going to be looking at the economy, we're going to be looking at political division, we're going to be looking at some of his domestic policies, and we're going to be looking at the rise of McCarthyism. Now, this is part of a playlist I'm doing on America, the American Dream, Reality and Illusion, 1945 to 1980. This is Unit 2Q in A-Level History from AQA. And in this video, I'm looking at a particular part of the specification, this particular bullet point, Truman and post-war Reconstruction, the economy, political divisions and domestic problems, the rise of McCarthyism. And what I will do in all the different videos on this playlist is I will pick a particular aspect of the specification, normally a particular bullet point, and I will go through the content on this. And so this is aimed as an aid, something to support A-level students in their studies, but also it should hopefully prove interesting and useful to anybody else who just wants to find out more about this period of American history. The economy, of course, is always vitally important, and this is a kind of vital stage in American political development. So America has just been one of the successful parties in the Second World War, and we're going to look at how, or to the extent to which Truman manages to take advantage of its fairly dominant position at this point in time. Now, his predecessor, Roosevelt, FDR, had employed what we know as Keynesian economics. Now, Keynesian economics is when a government pumps money into the economy, creating employment and creating demand to help an economy grow, to stimulate the economy to grow. Now, this is a form of economics which was particularly popular around this point in time, and Roosevelt is probably its greatest advocate, and Roosevelt managed to start to pull America out of the Great Depression through this method of economics. Now, Truman, maybe less enthusiastic about Keynesian economics, but still uses them to a fairly large extent. Now, what he's probably more interested in, which is something that he, again, would fit with his predecessor Roosevelt, is in liberal social reform. So we can see Truman as a reformer, we can see Truman as maintaining this belief in Keynesian economics. As I said, America had found itself in a dominant economic position in the world. Well, largely actually because the rest of the world was pretty much in disarray. Other nations generally owed America huge sums of money with really big war debts. And for example, we can pick out Britain as an example of this, that owed $31 billion in war loans. So if America is going to continue to grow and to find markets for its consumer goods and industrial output and agricultural output, then what it's going to need to do is it's going to need these economies to rebuild. And we see the setting up of a system to enable this, which is known as the Bretton Woods system. And this stems back to a meeting in New Hampshire in July 1944, unsurprisingly in a place called Bretton Woods. And at this, 44 allied nations met and they agreed to the creation of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. Now, you might well have heard of these. Their importance continues then from this point forwards. So these are institutions you might well hear of in the modern day, and they are based in New York, something Hamilton himself would have been very impressed with. So whilst again when he made the decisions about the deal to change the capital, he was insistent on keeping the financial powers of America in New York, and now you see the financial powers of the world being brought to New York. To join these key institutions, foreign governments had to agree to tie their monetary policy to the US dollar. And this is, again, a really important stage in American power and economic position, where the US dollar starts to become the dominant currency in the world. In theory, again, linking to the idea of Keynesian economics, the world economy should pick up with just a bit of a nudge, really. So if America just can pump some money in, then ultimately what happens, it'll get that money back in many different ways, because ultimately the economy will start going in other countries like Britain, and then they will buy American goods. They might buy American food, might be consumer goods, might be industrial goods, and therefore America will benefit from the fact that the rest of the economy start to pick up. Now, there are links here back to Roosevelt's New Deal, where a demand for the economy had been created. The Second World War had also created demand in the American economy. Some Americans even refer to the Second World War as the Good War, because it brought employment and a degree of economic prosperity, which they hadn't seen in the 30s following with the Depression. So those policies had done a lot. So the New Deal and Second World War done a lot to help the US economy recover from the Great Depression, but there were still issues that remained. Now, the kind of cornerstone of what Truman wanted to do was his fair deal, and this built on some policies that were already in place under Roosevelt, the biggest one of which had been the GI Bill of 1944. Now, this had provided help for returning veterans, and the idea was to make sure that they came back to a good life, and having made the sacrifices and gone off and fought for America, that they didn't come back to unemployment and poverty. So they were offered 90% mortgages, they were offered 52 weeks unemployment benefit, they were offered loans for college education, and 7.8 million veterans took advantage of this bill and made use of the money it provided. And this then leads us into Truman's flagship policy, which is the fair deal. And this combined the thing that I think was probably more important to him, the liberal social reform, alongside a kind of economic strategy of continuing the ideas of Keynesian economics. Now, the most significant challenge was demobilizing 9 million men from the army without creating unemployment and poverty, because essentially you now need to create 9 million more jobs to make sure that those men have got something meaningful in terms of an ability to support themselves and their families. Now, the Fair Deal included 21 points, and amongst these included federal aid for education, tax cuts for the lowest earners, plus increased public housing and increases in the minimum wage from 45 cents up to 75 cents an hour. It included national health insurance and broader social security coverage. It focused on the creation of a department for welfare, and then we've got some stuff in there for civil rights with anti-lynching laws and the FEPC being made permanent. Now, not all of this is going to pass. One of the things we'll see as we look at the political issues is that Truman doesn't have a good time with Congress. So although Truman is often given a bad press as president, there was definitely some high degrees of economic success. And again, there's some really good evidence here, I hope, to help back up that point in any essays or any writing you would be doing on it, or again, just in case you want to get in an argument with someone and defend Truman. So the GI Bill that I mentioned earlier invested $20 billion into the economy. So that is a real shot in the arm that's going to get the economy going, and we see some big impact of this. So, for example, this is the era of the baby boom. So 1945 to 1950, there's a massive increase in the birth rate. So you might well be aware of the modern term boomers. Well, that refers to the generation that are born in this period of time following the Second World War. And this massive spike in the birth rate created a massive amount of economic demand. So you've got people who are settling down, buying homes, buying more consumer goods, lots of things that they need as their families grow. And so with this, we see a kind of consumer boom. And an example of this is car sales. America dominated the world of cars. There were more cars in America than anywhere else in the world, and there are 2.1 million sold in 1946, but in 1955 it's 7.9 million. So again, we can see this evidence of growing affluence. Another shot in the arm for the economy is the maturing war bonds, which were sold to the American population during the Second World War, and this put $185 million in the pockets of Americans, and they went out and spent it. Again, a huge boom for the economy. And this is shown by the fact that industrial output had doubled and agricultural output was up by a third by 1952. Business investment that was starting at $14 billion a year was at $38 billion a year by the time we get to 52. Employment was up. It rose from 46 million to 61 million. So remember, I said one of the biggest challenges demobilization is making sure you can find work for these 9 million men. Well, there's extra work found for 15 million people. So in that, we can see an absolute success in terms of a key strategic aim, which was smooth demobilization, and by doing that, by increasing the employment rate, and the increasing employment rate is more than enough. And this idea of affluence is also shown by the fact that per capita income rose by 40%. So you look at that and go, well, people are earning 40% more than they were before. They are better off. This is a good economic situation. So we could look at all of this and go, well, actually, Truman is a kind of roaring success economically. So why all the anti-Truman jokes? Why all this stuff about Truman not being a great president? Well, partly because, well, on the other side of this, there are failures as well. Now, the government is running a budget deficit, which means that it is spending more money than it is taking in. Now, if you are in the period of the New Deal, where the economy needs stimulating and it needs getting going, then you can kind of see why a government might do that. But if you're getting to a point of massive economic growth and a boom, then you would expect that to change. You'd expect the government to reduce the amount it was spending and maybe save some for the next time there's a problem. But Truman's government doesn't seem to be doing that. So the economy is overheating and they're continuing to spend. There are also some issues here in terms of the promises that are made and then what's delivered. So the Housing Act of 1949 promised 810,000 federally subsidised new homes that would be supplied to low-income families. Now, by 1952, only 156,000 of these have been built, so we're a long way in between kind of promise and reality. Much of the Fair Deal, which I mentioned was kind of the cornerstone of what Truman wanted to do, doesn't even actually make it through Congress. His national health insurance scheme was attacked as socialised medicine. So again, imagine a Democratic president trying to get an extensive health insurance scheme through a Republican Congress. Well, actually, we don't really need to go back very long to see parallels, because we see similar things happening with Obama and Obamacare. But if you're going back to this, so Truman doesn't get through with one of the cornerstones of what he wants to do. His education acts are kind of really watered down, because the argument of most of Republicans in Congress is that education is a state issue, not a federal issue, and therefore they shouldn't be pouring a load of money in it. There was the prolonged war in Korea, and that, on top of all these other issues, led to astronomically high inflation. So inflation is the rate at which the cost of living or cost of goods is going up. And in 1945-46, this hit 25%. So that means prices are going up by a whole quarter every in a year. Now, currently, we're talking in the UK about the potential of a 5%, talking about 5% in inflation. People talking about a cost of living crisis and how are people going to cope with increasing bills and things like that. Well, if you think that this is 5 times higher than that. And Truman was trying to sort and control prices through the Office of Price Administration, which had been in place since Roosevelt, but these actions were largely failing. He also was seeing the knock-on of this in terms of the unions demanding large pay increases for their members. And you would do, wouldn't you? If you've got a job and the prices are going up by 25%, well, you want your wage to go up by 25%. And Truman's appealing to the trade unions to lessen their demands because of the impact that the high inflation is having on the economy, and the fact that it becomes kind of self-fulfilling. It just inflation goes up, so wages go up, so inflation goes up, so wages go up, and this starts to cause a massive problem. Now, the trade unions become far more powerful during the Second World War, as there was a shortage of labour, and in 1946 we see record levels of strike action. So there are 4.6 million workers involved in strikes through the year. There are 116 million working days lost. And the Republican Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act to cut union power. And this include actions about their recruiting, but in particular gave the president the power to impose an 80-day cooling off period before a strike, and so this is a fairly serious attack on union power. And again, we see the strength of this is a real challenge to Truman, and one of the criticisms of Truman is he doesn't deal with this very well. Now, the example where things probably go most badly wrong actually is in 1952. Truman seized control of the steel mills as strike action loomed, and he needed the steel for what was going on in the Korean War. In this, he overstepped his executive power, and the Supreme Court told him that he couldn't. The steel workers went on strike as the steel mills were returned to their former owners. Steel output fell by a third. So a kind of pretty much a disaster all round for Truman there. Now, the economic problems go hand in hand with some of the political divisions. So the Republicans took control of Congress in 46. It was the Democrats had absolutely dominated American politics around this time, and go on to dominate Congress for a substantial period afterwards. This is quite an unusual event, having a Republican Congress. And they'd won the midterms in 46 on the slogan of "Had enough." They opposed Truman's Fair Deal. They talked about him and his predecessor Roosevelt kind of exceeding what should be the right level of executive power in the Constitution. They said that they would stop the level of government intervention, make government smaller. They would return to market economics. They would cut taxes. And now, with that, they gain to power. But when then nothing happens, we end up with the fighting between Truman and Congress. So Truman calls Congress the Do-Nothing Congress. So even, for example, areas of social reform, which they'd said that they supported, they just don't do anything to get to do it. So they just don't pass anything. And so he calls them the Do-Nothing Congress because they reject large parts of the policy he pushes forward, notably huge swathes of his Fair Deal. But the other way of looking at it is one of the reasons why Congress does nothing is because Truman keeps vetoing their bills. So he vetoed an enormous 250 bills that were passed by Congress. Now, 12 times those vetoes are overridden, and this again gets us in a position where we can see some of the elements of Truman he's least popular, because to get a veto overridden takes 2/3 majority in both houses. So you have to be very much going against Congress if they're going to start overriding your veto. Truman's Democrat Party faced enormous splits. A southern group known as the Dixiecrats split off the party in 1948. They opposed Truman's liberal stance on race policies, and they ran on a platform of states' rights, which was scarily reminiscent of policies of the Civil War era. Now, Storm Thurmond ran for presidency in 48, and at the same time we've got another part of the Democrats splitting off, with former Vice President Henry Wallace leaving to form the Progressive Party, so suggesting the Democrats weren't going far enough, and they went to challenge Truman. And Truman was with all these internal divisions in the Democrats and bits of it splintering off, and the Republican Party seeming reinvigorated, Truman was expected to lose. The Republican candidate Dewey was confident to the point of arrogance. The Republican Congress was so convinced that they were going to see their first Republican president for a long period of time, that they had $80,000 put aside to spend on the inauguration. But Truman fought a very determined campaign, and his relatability, his normal, the fact that he seemed like a normal blue-collar guy who was just trying to do his best and was showing grit and determination, won him the election. And there's a very famous picture of Truman up above me where he's holding up the Chicago Tribune, which is saying Dewey defeats Truman, which was published a bit early when they didn't actually know the result, and Truman actually won in 48 by 2 million votes. Now, he could have stood again in 52, but chose not to, based on his own unpopularity at the time. He wasn't excluded from another term by the 22nd Amendment, which from Truman onwards does exclude a president for doing more than 2 terms. So he stands aside, and again, Truman therefore can take a degree of the blame for the political divisions, because he obviously hadn't got a handle on it to the extent that he just knew he would have no chance in an election, despite his record of defeating the odds in 48. One of the most interesting phenomena in this period of American history is the rise of McCarthyism. Now, in a lot of ways, it's quite hard to explain, and we'll look at some of the details of that very shortly. But one of the other bits I think is really interesting. This is some of the parallels you can draw from this into modern day America, and the kind of the Trump era. I think are really, really interesting. So, Joseph McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin. He first comes into office in 47. Now, he'd had a fairly unremarkable start to his career, was not seen as being a very good senator at all. In December 1950, he claimed that 205 Communist Party members were working in the US State Department. Now, this kind of shook America. This sent panic waves through America. Now, he continued from 50 through to his death in 57 to make a whole series of claims about communist conspiracies, but he was never actually able to prove any of them. In fact, he was even censored by Congress in 1954, and he dies finally of alcoholism in 1957. So we're looking, actually, in terms of the actions of Joseph McCarthy himself, we're looking at actions in a period of just 7 years. Now, the Tidings Committee that looked into his reports in 1950 found them to be a fraud and a hoax, and yet he's going to go on and have a hugely significant impact. So really, the basis of McCarthyism is a big lie. So what he's saying isn't actually true. In 52, he ends up actually heading congressional committees looking into communist subversives. And as we see, this idea, this paranoia, anti-communist paranoia that he starts to spread. And anti-communism did spread through American society, and it was encouraged by the Republican Party. It was encouraged by the context of the Cold War tensions. And it spread into not only federal government, but through state government as well. We see 500 state government employees fired for communist links. We see 600 school teachers and 150 college professors lose their jobs because of communist sympathizing. Now, and McCarthy then also starts to adopt this in the language and attacking political attacks. So he calls the Democrats the commie-crats. And this was a common and successful line of attack that Republicans started to use in 1952. And again, we see huge parallels in the modern day with this idea of Republicans or parts of the Republican Party calling anybody who disagrees with them, in particular Democrats, calling them communists. Well, when all the basis of all kind of political ideology, they quite clearly aren't. And it was the same at this point in time as well. So the parallels are really quite strong. So why did it have such a big impact if really the foundations of it are so weak? Well, part of that is that there was a real fear of communism in the US. So there was a fear of the military power of Russia and China in particular, in 49 when the USSR has successfully tested nuclear weapons. And so from that point onwards, we see a real fear, and they start to become the big threat. So the communists replaced the Nazis and the Japanese as the US enemy. So they had an enemy in the previous period during the war, and now there would almost seem to be a psychological need for a new enemy, and the communists fitted the bill for that. And we see some events such as the arrest, trial, and then execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were arrested for betraying secrets linked, in particular, some of them to this successful development of nuclear weapons by the USSR, and their conviction and trial and execution all remain enormously controversial. Again, more evidence has come out in preceding years, particularly since the opening of the archive in the USSR, and so there is still a kind of debate about all of that. But you'll see the kind of development, some of this stuff, it happens before McCarthy. So McCarthy is building on something that's already there. And we can see this with the anti-communist actions already taking place through the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had been put in place back in the 30s to monitor extreme groups. In 47, it began investigating the Hollywood 10, a group of writers and directors who were members of the American Communist Party. All of whom were convicted of contempt of Congress and sentenced to a year in prison. One of the rising stars in Congress was a Richard Nixon, who goes on obviously to be president later on, and he became significant in the HUAC, and he pursued Alger Hiss, who was accused of spying in the 1930s, and those statute of limitation meant they couldn't get him for that. He was ultimately convicted of perjury, again in a fairly controversial set of trials. So we see that element of it. Now, some of it links to the economics bit that we've been looking at. So we see the rise of organised labour, of the trade union movement in America. So this has been a new phenomenon. It takes place during the Second World War and is continuing during this period of post-war Reconstruction. And they're causing issues. They're causing loss of working days. They're causing disruption, and they're challenging the government. And in this, so this then becomes part of this fear of communism. So are the trade unions communists? Are they being controlled by communists? We can also say one of the reasons why McCarthyism has such a big impact is it wasn't properly challenged. And again, you can maybe see some parallels in America in this today. So the Democrats failed to properly defend those accused of communism, because the worry was if you defend the person accused of being a communist, then everyone points a finger at you. You're doing that because you're a communist as well. And again, what we see with this is those who did speak against McCarthy lost their seats in the 1952 election. And so, again, I can maybe see some parallels in terms of this, in terms of people fearing to speak out against particular former presidents because of the power that they might have in terms of influencing elections going forward. Now, could the Democrats have done a better job of rebuttaling about facing down these accusations? Well, yes, they could have done. But McCarthy had some really powerful and important supporters as well, most notably amongst the press. So what was the impact of McCarthyism? Well, essentially, it was mass hysteria. We see this take a real grip of American society and culture at this point in time. Lots of accusations being thrown around at anybody who didn't fit in or was a bit different, and really turning against some kind of American key principles in terms of freedom of thought and freedom of expression. There's some really good concrete stuff in here as well, again, which you can use to illustrate it. So you've got the 1952 Internal Security Committee, the Internal Security Act, which meant that communists could be denied passports. Again, it seems to fundamentally go against American principles of civil rights. But Truman thought that, and he vetoed it. But only 58 members of Congress supported him, and so his veto was overridden. But we do see stuff coming from the president himself as well. So we see Executive Order 9835, which set up the federal loyalty boards, which again, their job was rooting out communists from federal government. So you can see why there's mass hysteria in a way, because it appears that both political parties believe that there's something in this. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, key parts of foreign policy, again seem to cast the USSR as the enemy. Now, the lies of McCarthyism, or the hysteria of McCarthyism, is then used by the Republicans to attack the weakened Democrats. And this tactic worked. They win the presidency, and we see Eisenhower winning in '52, and this is the first Republican president for over 20 years. So this tactic works, and so it's likely to continue. And as I've mentioned, there seems to be here a restriction on freedom of speech, or freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and we even see attacks on the work of literary icons like Mark Twain, who the creator of Huckleberry Finn, and so there's people turning around and going, well, this is un-American and that is un-American, and it turns essentially into a bit of a witch hunt. So I hope this has proved a helpful look at this period of Truman and post-war Reconstruction, looking at some economics, some politics, and this phenomenon that was McCarthyism. So as I said, this is part of my playlist looking at the American Dream 45 to 1980 in the US. My channel also has playlists on the Tudors, on communist and Tsarist Russia, on modern Britain, on the American Civil War and Reconstruction. So there's lots of history on there. There is also loads and loads of stuff of UK and US politics designed for the A-level politics course. So again, hopefully lots there for A-level students and other people who are just interested in history and in politics. So if it's been helpful for you, then please hit like. If the rest of that sounds good, then please do subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, then please leave them below. Thank you very much for watching.